June 24, 1812, Napoleon marches with the largest army Europe has ever seen into the heart of his former ally. Victory seems within reach, but the Russians stand resolute, retreating into the unforgiving winter. As the temperature plummets and supplies run low, what began as a grand conquest turns into a nightmare. Brace yourself for one of the most dramatic invasions in European history. In 1807, following his victory at Friedland, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia signed the Treaty of Tilsit, solidifying a temporary alliance. However, relations deteriorated over the next few years due to multiple factors. Napoleon's establishment of the Duchy of Warsaw was seen as a threat to Russian interests. By 1810, Alexander withdrew from the continental system, which was damaging Russia's economy. This move led to illicit trade with the British, infuriating Napoleon. The growing mistrust culminated in April 1812, when Alexander issued an ultimatum demanding the withdrawal of French troops from his territories. But Napoleon refused, and he mobilized a grand army for an invasion. But before the invasion began, Russia secured diplomatic wins that bolstered its defense. In 1812, King of Sweden, former French Marshal Bernadotte, agreed to remain neutral, who became hostile to Napoleon after France seized Swedish Pomerania. Simultaneously, Russia signed a peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire after long war. These two agreements secured Russia's northern and southern borders, freeing up troops to fight against Napoleon's Grand Army. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, of around 600,000 troops from across the continent, but most of them were foreign troops, from different allies. The Duchy of Warsaw, Saxony, Bavaria, Westphalia, and Italy, and even recent enemies like Prussia and Austria. Napoleon's invasion force was divided into three main armies: the first army led by Napoleon himself, the second led by his adopted son, Eugene, Viceroy of Italy, and the third by his brother Jerome, King of Westphalia. On the left, Marshal MacDonald with the Prussian 10th Corps guarded the northern flank, while General Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps was in the right. Napoleon's cavalry, under Marshal Murat, served as the vanguard. De Wout led the 1st Corps and Oudinot led the 2nd Corps. There were also 100,000 troops were in reserve. The Russian army was strategically positioned in three armies: Barclay de Tolly's 1st Army in the north, Bagration's 2nd Army to the south, and Tourmassar's 3rd Reserve Army in the southwest. The Russian army was around 250,000 troops. They were greatly outnumbered. On the 24th of June 1812, Grande Army began crossing the Niemen River into Russia. Napoleon advanced north to Vilnius. His initial strategy was to defeat the Russian forces by separating them. Napoleon aimed to strike and defeat General Barclay de Tolly's army. Meanwhile, Jerome Bonaparte was ordered to hold Prince Bagration's army in place, with the ultimate goal of trapping both Russian forces. However, Barclay, a cautious commander, chose to retreat and burn villages and crops. Bagration, a more aggressive leader, refused to retreat. Only an order from the Tsar forced Bagration to retreat. After Napoleon reached Vilnius, but Barclay already retreated. Meanwhile, Jerome failed to hold Bagration, so Napoleon sent Marshal Davout, the 1st Corps, to trap Bagration, but he escaped the trap. Jerome struggled in his command, frustrated by supply issues and criticized by Napoleon, and failed to hold back Bagration's army. Ultimately, Napoleon reassigned Jerome's troops to Marshal Davout, leading a humiliated Jerome to abandon his post and return to his kingdom. The Russian scorched turf strategy left the French army struggling to live off the land, and soldiers, unaccustomed to long marches, began to desert or collapse from exhaustion. The army had to make frequent stops, which slowed Napoleon's advance. After a brief rest at Vilnius, Napoleon resumed his advance. But Barclay continued his retreat to Vitebsk, hoping to unite with Bagration. But Davout blocked his path. At Vitebsk, Napoleon clashed with Barclay's rearguard, but the Russians escaped, burning supplies as they retreated. Meanwhile, the Russian Third Reserve Army had defeated the Saxon Seventh Corps at the Battle of Corbrin, forcing Napoleon to send reinforcements. By the end of July, Napoleon's army has suffered heavily from exhaustion and disease, which reduced his army to 200,000 men. Cossacks harassed French supply lines, forcing Napoleon to send troops for defense. After staying several days at Vitebsk, Napoleon received news of victories by Schwarzenberg and Bavarian forces, securing his flanks for the moment. It is now early August 1812. Napoleon's army has pushed deep into Russian territory. The Russians adopted scorched earth policy, retreating while destroying villages, crops, and supplies to deny the French from any resources. The Grande Army reduced to 200,000 men due to exhaustion, disease, and desertion. Barclay de Tolly and Bagration have retreated towards Smolensk. Napoleon focused on capturing Smolensk, aiming to draw the Russians into a decisive battle. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander, influenced by Bagration's criticisms of Barclay's continued retreats, demanded a more aggressive stance, pressuring Barclay to abandon his cautious strategy. By mid-August, Barclay de Tolly cautiously prepared for battle, his army now around 130,000 men. Barclay moved toward Rudnya. Believing Napoleon's forces were concentrated there, he ordered Platoff's Cossacks to attack the French cavalry corps. However, false reports of French movements to outflank his army forced Barclay to abandon the plan. Meanwhile, Napoleon seized the opportunity and launched a brilliant maneuver to outflank the Russians and cross the Dnieper River on August 14th. However, the Russian 27th Division put up fierce resistance near Krosly, delaying the French advance and giving Bagration time to reinforce Smolensk. By the time the French reached Smolensk, the opportunity for a decisive surprise attack was gone. As the Russian army began its retreat, the attack on Smolensk finally commenced 2 days later. Napoleon ordered a direct assault on the city's defences. On August 16th, Napoleon launched a major assault with 3 corps and 200 artillery pieces. While initial successes set the city ablaze, the Russians refused to be drawn into open battle. Despite the Russians' bravely, the French and Polish forces breached the walls. In 17th of August, Barclay, fearing encirclement, ordered a retreat, and by evening of 18th of August the city was completely destroyed, just as the French forces entered. Napoleon, however, missed a crucial opportunity to trap the Russians. While Bagration's Second Army retreated first, Barclay's rearguard was caught by Ney's Third Corps at Valiatino. Yet General Junit, leading the Westphalian Corps, tasked to block Barclay's retreat, but failed to take action, allowing the Russians to escape. The French army suffered 12,500 casualties, while the Russians 13,500, and although the city was destroyed, no decisive victory was achieved. With the Russian forces successfully regrouping, Napoleon paused to plan his next moves. Napoleon faced a critical choice: push on to Moscow or halt for the winter. Pressing forward promised a decisive victory against a disorganized enemy, but carried enormous risks with the campaign season nearly over. Halting at Smolensk would allow his army to recover, but it risked giving Russia time to regroup. Napoleon chose to gamble advance, leading 120,000 troops toward Moscow in late August. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander also made a pivotal decision. The backlash against Barclay's cautious strategy became impossible to ignore. To restore morale and unify command, he appointed General Mikhail Kutuzov as commander-in-chief. Kutuzov had suffered a humiliating defeat by Napoleon at the Battle of Austerlitz 7 years earlier. However, in the Russo-Turkish War 1806–1812, Kutuzov achieved his greatest victory yet at the decisive Battle of the Danube, forcing the Ottomans to sign a peace treaty. Kutuzov shared Barclay's preference for delay, but recognized the need for a stand to rally the army and the nation. So in the west of Moscow, near Borodino, the Russians prepared for a decisive battle. A fateful day was approaching, one that would become the bloodiest of the Napoleonic Wars for Europe. Napoleon reached Borodino on September 5th, but his advance was delayed at the Shevardino redoubt, a key position anchoring their left flank. That evening, Murat's cavalry engaged Konovnitsin's forces, driving them back toward the redoubt in fierce engagement. On September 6th, Napoleon launched a full assault. Kompen's division of Devout's corps attacked from the front, while Prince Poniatowski's Polish forces struck from the south. French artillery bombarded the redoubt as waves of infantry surged forward. The Russians, under Gorchakov, mounted fierce counterattacks. After hours of brutal fighting, the redoubt changed hands several times. But finally, as night fell, the battered Russians withdrew, ceding the redoubt. The French victory cost them 4,000 casualties. While Russian losses reached 6,000, the Russians retreated to their main defensive line. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with over 600,000 men, aiming to force Tsar Alexander to make peace. However, the Russians adopted a strategy of retreat, trading space for time. The campaign took a heavy toll on the Grande Army, with disease, hunger, and exhaustion had reduced the army to 120,000 troops, less than half its original size. By early September, Kutuzov decided to make a stand near Borodino to protect Moscow. The Russian army at Borodino, commanded by General Kutuzov, occupied a defensive position stretching across the new and old Smolensk roads. Barclay de Tolly's First Army anchored the right, protected by the steep banks of the Kutlo-Char River. The centre featured the massive Ravsky redoubt, an open-backed earthwork armed with heavy artillery, providing a clear field of fire over the central approach. On the left, Bagration's Second Army held a more exposed position, reinforced by earthworks, including the 3 arrow-shaped flèches. While the Shevardino redoubt was expected to delay the French advance, had fallen on September 6th. Despite this, Kutuzov maintained his initial deployment, relying on artillery and earthworks to delay Napoleon's attack. Meanwhile, on the other side, Marshal Devout proposed to Napoleon a bold flanking maneuver to exploit the exposed Russian left, but Napoleon rejected it as too risky. Instead, he concentrated his forces for a massive frontal assault. Around 6 a.m., the 102-gun French Grand Battery opened fire on the Russian defences. Marshal Devout's First Corps, led by Kompen's division with Desseix's division on the left. They faced strong resistance from Vorontsov's and Neverovsky's Russian divisions, and Devout himself was wounded in the fighting. By 7:30 a.m., the French briefly captured the Flatches, only to be driven back by a fierce counterattack from Prince Bagration. Ney's Third Corps joined the attack, and Murat led a cavalry charge to repel a Russian cavalry counterattack. On the right, Poniatowski's Polish Fifth Corps advanced toward Utitsa, but struggled with difficult terrain and strong resistance from Tuchkor's Russian militia. On the left, Eugene's 4th Corps attacked Borodino village, held by Russian Guard Jaegers. After clearing the village, Eugene's forces advanced toward the Ravsky redoubt, but were driven back. Despite heavy French artillery fire, Russian reinforcements, including Yermolov's horse artillery, unleashed a powerful barrage. In this counter-attack, Russian General Kutuzov, chief of artillery, was killed in action leading one of these counter-attacks. To the south, Poniatowski's Polish 5th Corps captured Atitsa after intense fighting. During the engagement, General Tuchkov was mortally wounded. However, the Polish advance was halted when Russian reinforcements, led by General Baghoфот, arrived to stabilize the position. In the center, the French launched 7 attacks on the flank, but each time they were repelled in intense hand-to-hand fighting. At his headquarters, Kutuzov left tactical decisions to Barclay de Tolly and Prince Bagration. At 11 a.m., Prince Bagration was hit by a cannonball, mortally wounded. He was carried from the field. The exhausted Russians began retreating in disarray, and the French finally captured the flank. Marshal Murat, seizing the opportunity, led forward Friant's division. Supported by heavy cavalry on both flanks, the Russians formed squares to repel the advancing French cavalry, while chaotic melees broke out between the opposing cavalry forces. Despite the Russians' fierce resistance, the relentless French pressure proved overwhelming. By midday, Friant's division pushed into the village of Semenovskaya, further destabilizing the Russian center. Napoleon, at his headquarters near Shevardino, was urged by his staff to commit the Imperial Guard as the Russian center wavered, but he refused. Instead, he ordered General Sorbia's Guard artillery to unleash a devastating barrage. Despite heavy losses, the Russians held, and the Guard remained in reserve. Around 11:30 a.m., Generals Platov and Uvarov led 8,000 cavalry and Cossacks across the Kutlocha River, targeting French and Italian troops near Borodino. Their surprise raid caused confusion, forcing Eugene to halt his attack on the Ravsky redoubt and pull back his forces. With no infantry support, Platov and Uvarov were unable to press their advantage and retreated. However, the raid delayed Eugene's assaults by 2 crucial hours, giving the Russians valuable time to reinforce their weakening defenses. Around 3 p.m., Napoleon ordered the final assault on the Ravsky redoubt. Led by Brussia's, Morin's, and Gerard's divisions, advanced under heavy Russian cannon fire. Russian defenders, including Likachev's 24th Division, fought valiantly under the rallying cry, "Brothers, behind us is Moscow." As the French artillery bombarded the defenders, French cuirassiers charged through the rear of the redoubt, but suffered heavy losses. Saxon and Polish cavalry led daring charge into the rear of the redoubt, breaking through Russian infantry and gunners with many cut down as they stood their ground. Despite their fierce resistance, the redoubt fell by 3:30 p.m. and General Likachev was captured. As French infantry secured the redoubt, Eugene ordered a cavalry advance to exploit the breach. However, the Russian Guard cavalry counterattacked, inflicting heavy losses on the advancing French. As dusk fell, fighting slowly died out across the battlefield. Mikhail Kutuzov, aware of the heavy toll on his army, chose to withdraw under the cover of darkness, retreating in good order. Napoleon had won the field but failed to destroy the Russian army, leaving his ultimate victory uncertain. In June 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia with over 600,000 men, aiming to force Tsar Alexander I into submission. The Russians retreated, employing scorched earth tactics that left the French starving and exhausted. On September 7th, the armies clashed at Borodino, resulting in a costly Pyrrhic victory for Napoleon. A week later, on September 14th, his Grande Army entered Moscow. To Napoleon's surprise, Moscow was deserted, and Governor Fyodor Rostopchin ordered the destruction of supplies to prevent their use by the French. Shortly after Napoleon's arrival, fires, allegedly set by Russian arsonists, engulfed 2/3 of the city, denying him a winter base. The French troops executed suspected arsonists and began looting the ruined city, but the occupation came at a heavy cost, with around 10,000 French soldiers lost in Moscow. Napoleon, seeking peace, sent a letter to Tsar Alexander, but received no reply. Hoping for a response, he delayed his departure, waiting too long. On October 13th, the first snow fell, signaling the approaching winter. Meanwhile, Russian reinforcements strengthened their position. On October 18th, Mikhail Kutuzov launched a surprise attack on Murat's forces at Turretino, inflicting 3,000 casualties, capturing 36 to 38 French guns, and destroying valuable French cavalry units. This was a heavy blow to Napoleon, forcing him to order an immediate evacuation of Moscow. On a rainy day, October 19th, 90,000 troops of the Grande Army departed the city. Non-combatants, sick, and wounded accompanying the retreating army. These individuals, many unable to fight or march. At that time, Wittgenstein defeated Marshal St. Cyr, compelling Marshal Victor to provide reinforcements. Meanwhile, Admiral Chichagov drove the Austrians into retreat. Meanwhile, Napoleon sought to pass through Kaluga, aiming to secure supplies and easier route out of Russia. However, General Dokhturov's 6th Corps blocked the way. On October 24th, fierce fighting erupted at Maloyaroslavets, with the town changing hands 8 times, before Eugene's the 4th Corps ultimately drove out the Russians. Although the French secured a tactical victory by holding the town, Napoleon decided to abandon this route and retreat northward. On October 25th, Napoleon narrowly avoided capture by Cossacks, thanks to the intervention of his grenadiers. After this close call, he began carrying a vial of poison around his neck as a safeguard against being taken prisoner. Napoleon, forced to retreat along the devastated Smolensk road, faced relentless Cossack raids and growing starvation. On October 29th, temperatures dropped below freezing, causing immense suffering as men and horses perished and discipline began to collapse. On the 3rd of November 1812, the French rearguard, led by Dennewitz the 1st Corps, was caught by Russian forces in Vyazma. The French column became stretched thin. After intense fighting, Eugene's the 4th Corps and Ney's the 3rd Corps came to their aid, but the battle ended in brutal street fighting within the burning town of Vyazma. Despite their efforts, the French were forced to retreat, suffering heavy casualties. Ney's the 3rd Corps formed the rearguard. On 4th of November, temperature plummeted to -15 degrees Celsius. Many soldiers froze to death. Many also deserted the army, but they were caught by Cossacks, who killed some, robbed others, and left many to freeze. Some foragers were even handed over to peasants, seeking revenge against them. Napoleon reached Smolensk on the 9th of November. Early French forces plundered the city's resources, leaving Ney's rearguard destitute. This scarcity, coupled with the army's weakened condition, forced Napoleon to continue the retreat. However, Napoleon spent 5 days at Smolensk, which gave Kutuzov the chance to prepare an ambush at Krosny. When the French army arrived, they were caught off guard, and in 3 days of fierce fighting, Napoleon ordered his Imperial Guard to hold the road open, allowing his forces to escape with enormous losses. The Young Guard launched a desperate attack to cover the retreat, suffering devastating casualties. Kutuzov, despite his advantage, delayed his pursuit. Ney's rearguard arrived at Krosny on November 18th, only to find the road blocked by the Russians. Rejecting calls to surrender, Ney led his men in a daring escape across the frozen Dnieper River at night, with Ney personally pulling men from the icy waters. Despite under constant attack from Cossacks, Ney and around 800 survivors reached Orsha, where their arrival was celebrated as a miraculous feat. Napoleon said, "The army of France is full of brave men, but Michel Ney is truly the bravest of the brave." After the Battle of Krosny, Napoleon narrowly avoided the complete encirclement of his army. However, 3 Russian armies were closing in: Kutuzov's main force of 60,000 from the east, Wittgenstein's 30,000 from the north, and Chichagov's 35,000 from the south. Napoleon's army was reduced to just 30,000 combat-ready troops, accompanied by numerous non-combatants. French supply depots at Polotsk and Vitebsk had already fallen to the Russians, cutting off critical resources. Napoleon set his sights on Minsk, home to vast supply stores. However, on November 21st, devastating news reached him: Minsk had fallen, along with Borisov and its crucial bridge. Marshal Oudinot and his resilient II Corps joined Napoleon's army and launched an immediate assault on Borisov, successfully recapturing the town. However, the Russians had destroyed the bridge over the Berezina River, hindering their progress. With the main bridge at Borisov destroyed, Napoleon's fortunes turned when Polish cavalry discovered a fordable location. Napoleon ordered a diversion by staging false preparations for a crossing in the south. Meanwhile, General Ebel's engineers, braving freezing conditions and often working chest-deep in icy water, completed 2 pontoon bridges in just 24 hours. Napoleon's forces began crossing the Berezina River using the hastily constructed pontoon bridges. General Oudinot led the vanguard to establish a defensive position on the west bank. However, Chichagov regrouped, and fierce fighting erupted. On the west bank, Oudinot was seriously wounded, but Marshal Ney took command, repelling Russian attacks with a decisive cavalry charge by General Dumas. Meanwhile, on the east bank, Victor's rearguard endured relentless assaults from Wittgenstein, holding their ground until nightfall before retreating across the bridges. At dawn on the 29th, in -30°C, thousands of stragglers panicked, rushing to the bridges. Many were crushed, drowned, or froze. When the bridges were burned later, those left behind faced the cold and advancing Russians, with most captured or killed. As the remnants of the Grande Army staggered toward Vilna, temperatures plummeted to -37°C. Frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion claimed thousands of lives daily. The pursuing Russian armies paused, their task nearly complete. On December 5th, Napoleon departed the army, traveling incognito to Paris. He reached the capital in just 13 days, driven by the urgency of addressing a political crisis threatening his empire. While many perceived his departure as a betrayal, his generals defended it as a necessary move to safeguard the future of France. By December 9th, only 15,000 emaciated survivors crossed the Niemen River back into Polish territory. According to legend, Marshal Ney was the last man to cross. Just 6 months earlier, 600,000 men had marched into Russia. Now, fewer than 10% of that grand army remained. The French losses were staggering. 100,000 soldiers died in combat, 200,000 succumbed to other causes, such as starvation, exposure, and disease. An estimated 50,000 perished in captivity, 50,000 were wounded, 50,000 deserted, and 100,000 were taken prisoner. Following his catastrophic defeat in Russia, all of his enemies united against him. But Napoleon will not go down without a fight. The fate of Europe is about to be decided in the greatest campaign in history. After his disastrous invasion of Russia, Napoleon returned to Paris to rebuild his shattered army, leaving the remnants of the Grande Army under the command of Marshal Murat, who was unwell. However, Murat abandoned the army to return to his kingdom of Naples, prompting Napoleon's adopted son, Eugene, to take command. Meanwhile, some advisors urged Emperor Alexander I to negotiate peace with Napoleon, but he resolved to press on and revenge the destruction of Moscow. At that time, Prussia signed a truce with Russia, and Austria declared neutrality. Russian armies swiftly advanced, culminating in their entry into Warsaw on February 7th. Concurrently, Eugene, after establishing garrisons in strategic fortresses, retreated westward. Many of these garrisons subsequently faced sieges. On February 28th, the Russians entered Berlin without resistance. On March 9th, Prussia declared war on France, and 8 days later, King Frederick William III issued his famous proclamation, "And main folk to my people," marking the start of the War of German Liberation. Since its defeat in 1806, Prussia had reformed its army under General von Scharnhorst. Additionally, Prussia formed Freikorps volunteer irregular units made up of students, urbanites, and others, including the renowned Lützen Freikorps. The Prussians mobilized an army of 80,000 regular troops to bolster the newly formed Sixth Coalition against Napoleon. Around the same time, Sweden also joined the coalition. Its Crown Prince, Karl Johann, formerly Marshal Bernadotte of France, had turned against Napoleon after becoming Sweden's heir in 1810. By 1813, Bernadotte had assembled a Swedish force of 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, Napoleon worked hard to assemble a massive new Grande army. He called up 138,000 conscripts, mobilized 80,000 National Guard troops, brought in 45,000 veterans from Spain, 20,000 survivors from Russia, and 16,000 Marines. Despite these efforts, many troops were still being mobilized. There was a critical shortage of cavalry and artillery, with many lost in Russia. The new conscripts were mostly inexperienced and aged between 21 and 23. Despite their lack of training, many still believed in Napoleon's legendary genius on the battlefield. At that time, the French had been pushed back, with Eugene retreating to the city of Magdeburg. Dresden had fallen into Prussian hands, while Russian Cossacks raided deep behind French lines, reaching as far as Hamburg and sparking local uprisings against French occupation. However, on 28th of April, Field Marshal Kutuzov died by pneumonia. Peter Wittgenstein took command of the Russian army. Napoleon now had 220,000 troops, while the Allies 180,000 troops. Napoleon ordered Marshal Davout with 35,000 troops to Hamburg. As Napoleon marched towards Saxony, the Allied army, instead of retreating, they decided the bold decision to stand and fight. The Allies devised a plan to strike Napoleon's right flank as he crossed the Saale River. Napoleon's limited cavalry left him with little intelligence on their movements. On May 1st, as French forces advanced toward Lützen, Marshal Bessières, leading a reconnaissance mission near the village of Rippock, was struck by a cannonball and killed instantly. Bessières was one of Napoleon's oldest and most trusted marshals, just like Lannes. On May 2nd, Marshal Ney's, the Third Corps, was stationed southwest of Lützen, assigned the critical task of holding the French right flank. His troops were dispersed across several villages in the area. The Prussian-Russian forces, advancing from Pagau, launched their attack late in the morning. Around 11:30 a.m., General Blecker led the Prussian assault, aiming for Großgarten. Expecting to confront only a small French detachment, Blecker instead encountered a full division. He immediately ordered a bombardment of the French lines before pushing forward with an attack. The Prussians succeeded in driving the French out of Großgarten, capturing Kleingarten and Rana. Ney, however, quickly mounted a counterattack, regaining the villages after fierce fighting that resulted in heavy losses on both sides. Yet, at around 2 p.m., Blecker sent his last brigade forward, forcing the French to retreat again. The Prussians advanced as far as Kaya, before Blecker being wounded. Napoleon, who had been visiting the site of the 1630 Battle of Lützen nearby, heard the cannon fire and rushed to the battlefield. By mid-afternoon, he arrived and began rallying the retreating conscripts. As French reinforcements arrived, Ney successfully halted the Allied advance at Kaya. By 4 p.m., the intensity of the battle increased as both sides committed their reserves. The villages, particularly Kaya, changed hands several times as the fighting raged on. As the Allied forces pressed their advance, Napoleon ordered his Grande battery, a concentrated mass of 100 guns, to unleash a devastating cannonade. With the arrival of Bertrand's the 4th Corps and MacDonald's the 11th Corps on Napoleon's flanks, the French position was secured. Finally, Napoleon sent in the Imperial Guard for a massive counterattack aimed at reclaiming the villages. A desperate cavalry charge from the Prussians briefly pushed the French from Rolla, but after intense fighting, the French managed to drive back the Prussian and Russian forces by 6 p.m. By nightfall, the coalition army began to retreat in good order, narrowly avoiding a complete rout due to the lack of sufficient French cavalry to pursue them. The Battle of Lützen ended in a costly French victory. Napoleon's forces suffered around 20,000 casualties, while the coalition army lost approximately 15,000 men, including General Gerhard von Scharnhorst. Reflecting on the battle, Napoleon remarked, "These animals have learned something." Despite their defeat, the Allied forces retreated in good order, due to the French army's lack of cavalry for pursuit. As Napoleon advanced eastward, preparing for another confrontation, he sent Marshal Ney toward Berlin to pressure the Prussians into defending their capital and potentially split the Allied army. However, the coalition regrouped near Bautzen, positioning themselves close to the Austrian border in an effort to draw Austria into the war. Napoleon directed Ney to move south, while he focused on pinning down the coalition army. In 2 days of fierce fighting at Bautzen, the Allies fought with great determination. Marshal Ney's confusion over orders led to delays, preventing the French from encircling the Allies, though they managed to capture Bautzen on the first day. On the second day, the French launched heavy assaults, but Ney once again failed to cut off the coalition's retreat, allowing them to escape. The French suffered significant losses. During the pursuit, Grand Marshal of the Palace, General Giraud Duroc, was mortally wounded by a cannonball and died shortly after, leaving Napoleon deeply upset. Again, Napoleon's lack of cavalry prevented him from pursuing the retreating enemy. To make up for this, he dispatched Marshal Oudinot to capture Berlin. However, Oudinot suffered a defeat at Luckau at the hands of General von Bülow. Following the Battle of Bautzen, Napoleon agreed to a truce with the coalition, as requested by Austria. On June 2nd, this led to the signing of the Armistice of Pläswitz on June 4th. Reflecting on it later, Napoleon admitted that agreeing to the truce was a mistake. Napoleon accepted the truce primarily to rebuild his cavalry, which had been critical in preventing him from achieving decisive victories. Additionally, he hoped to use the time to secure Austria as an ally or at least neutral. In 1810, Napoleon had married Marie-Louise, the daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I, making the emperor his father-in-law. However, Austrian Foreign Minister Clemens von Metternich had different intentions. Metternich sought to establish peace in Europe and restore a balance of power, which would weaken Napoleon without fully destroying him. This will prevent Russia from becoming too powerful. On June 26, 1813, Metternich met Napoleon in Dresden to negotiate terms for peace. Metternich's proposals included the return of Illyria to Austria, the repartition of Poland, and the dissolution of the Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's coalition of German states. However, Napoleon refused these terms, famously throwing his hat to the ground in a fit of rage. Metternich responded saying, "Peace and war lie in your Majesty's hands. Today, you can still make peace. Tomorrow, it may be too late." Napoleon replied, "I would rather face 1,000,000 men in the field than negotiate at the table." On August 12, 1813, Austria officially joined the Sixth Coalition and declared war on France. The Allied forces were now organized into 4 major armies: the Army of the North led by Crown Prince Karl John, the Army of Silesia, commanded by General Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, famously known as Marshal Vorwärts, Marshal Forwards, the Russo-Prussian Reserve Army, under General Bennigsen, and the main force the Army of Bohemia commanded by the 3 Allied monarchs and Field Marshal Schwarzenberg. At Trachenberg, the Allies formed the Trachenberg Plan to defeat Napoleon by avoiding direct battle with him and instead targeting his marshals, weakening his forces while building an overwhelming army. On the other side, Napoleon managed to rebuild his cavalry, though it remained weak. Taking the initiative, he ordered Marshal Oudinot and the Army of Berlin to resume the advance on Berlin. Crown Prince Karl Johann considered retreating, but the Prussians urged him to stand and fight. On August 23rd, at Groß-Beeren, the Army of the North secured a stunning victory through intense fighting. At that time, Napoleon advanced toward General Blücher's Army of Silesia, seeking a decisive battle. However, Blücher retreated. Soon after, Napoleon received reports from Marshal St-Cyr that the entire army of Bohemia was marching toward Dresden. Napoleon left Marshal MacDonald in command of the army of the Bobber, while he marched rapidly to Dresden, sending Vandame's the First Corps with 50,000 men to cut off the Allies' retreat. Europe is on the brink of witnessing one of Napoleon's most brilliant and hard-fought victories. After the Armistice of Pläswitz, Napoleon sought a decisive battle and advanced towards Blücher. Simultaneously, Oudinot marched north towards Berlin, but suffered defeat at Groß-Beeren. Blücher retreated just as Napoleon arrived, and reports soon reached Napoleon from Marshal St-Cyr that the massive army of Bohemia was advancing towards Dresden. Napoleon left Marshal MacDonald to monitor Blücher's movements, while he rapidly marched his forces towards Dresden. To cut off the Allies' potential escape routes, Napoleon dispatched Vandame's the First Corps, comprising 50,000 men. In Dresden, the capital of Saxony, Marshal St-Cyr commanded a garrison of 20,000 men. Vastly outnumbered by the approaching Allied force of 200,000, 10-1 disadvantage, St-Cyr fortified the city's defences. 5 redoubts were constructed, and artillery positions along the Elbe River secured the vulnerable left flank, while marshy terrain shielded the right. The Allies hesitate in their plans. Tsar Alexander wanted to attack quickly, believing Napoleon was far away, while Schwarzenberg wanted to wait for more troops. The Allied assault on Dresden finally began around 3 p.m. on August 26. Wittgenstein advanced, colliding with St-Cyr's defensive lines. French artillery, well positioned in the fortified redoubts and along the Elbe River, rained devastating fire on the advancing troops, resulting in heavy losses. Despite the relentless French bombardment, Kleist Prussians pushed into the Große Garten, forcing the outnumbered French defenders to fall back toward the city. In the centre, Austrian forces launched fierce assaults on the French redoubts. After intense fighting, they succeeded in capturing the third redoubt and threatened to overrun the fourth and fifth as well. The situation for St-Cyr was becoming critical. In response, St-Cyr ordered a limited counterattack, which slowed down the Allied advance. By late afternoon, Napoleon arrived on the battlefield. and immediately dispatched reinforcements. Marshal Ney and Marshal Mortier led for divisions of the Young Guard into the city. Simultaneously, Marshal Murat led forward his cavalry and struck the Allied centre on the Friedrichstadt plain. Murat's cavalry smashed into the Austrian columns, taking an entire regiment prisoner, driving the enemy back. The French launched a counteroffensive. Ney's Young Guard divisions and St-Cyr's forces retook the third redoubt. By nightfall, the French had regained nearly all of St-Cyr's original defensive positions. A torrential downpour drenched the battlefield, turning the ground into deep mud and swelling the streams. Overnight, Napoleon's forces were significantly reinforced by Victor's II Corps, Marmont's VI Corps, and the Guard cavalry, bringing his army to 135,000 men. In contrast, the Allies fielded 215,000 troops. Napoleon identified the Allied left as a vulnerable point. Napoleon organized his forces strategically. Murat and Victor took position on the left. Marmont and St-Cyr held the centre, while Ney, supported by the Young Guard and Guard cavalry, commanded the right. The battle began at 6 a.m. with devastating cannon fire. Victor advanced, driving back the Austrians after fierce fighting. In the centre, St-Cyr took Strelin, but a Prussian counterattack caused heavy losses. By 11 a.m., Ney and the Young Guard pushed back Wittgenstein's forces. At 11:30 a.m., Murat and Victor began their biggest attack on the Allied left. Victor's infantry advanced, pushing the Austrians back in brutal combat. Meanwhile, Murat's cuirassiers and dragoons smashed into the exposed Austrian lines, inflicting heavy losses on the Austrians. A French observed, Murat, cut off from the Austrian army Klenau's course, hurling himself upon it at the head of the Carabineers and cuirassiers. Nearly all Klenau's battalions were compelled to lay down their arms, and 2 other divisions of infantry at their fate. The torrential rain rendered Austrian muskets useless. Victor's divisions pushed on, capturing thousands of prisoners. By early afternoon, Allied left flank was almost destroyed. Over 15,000 men were lost. General Moreau, a former rival of Napoleon, was struck by a cannonball, crippling him. By 5 p.m., the Allies began a slow retreat, withdrawing south into the Bohemian mountains under the cover of rain and a strong rearguard. The Allies suffered a disastrous defeat, suffering heavy losses. As they retreated, they remained unaware of the looming danger. Vandam's First Corps was poised to strike at their rear. However, for Napoleon, within 10 days, reports would arrive that would completely turn the situation on its head. When Napoleon left to defend Dresden, he left Marshal MacDonald in command of the 100,000-strong army of the Bobber. Seizing the opportunity, Blücher, now aware of Napoleon's absence, turned his 95,000 men toward MacDonald. Despite harsh weather and low morale, Blücher's army advanced with determination. The Battle of Katzbach unfolded in chaos under torrential rain and rising floodwaters. On August 26, 1813, Marshal MacDonald ordered to outflank Blücher's army. However, swollen rivers and misunderstanding fragmented the French lines. Blücher seized the opportunity, launching a fierce counterattack with his right wing. Unable to fire muskets due to the rain, the battle devolved into brutal melee combat with bayonets. Noticing a gap, the Prussian cavalry smashed into the French lines. The French II Cavalry Corps were routed, and an entire French division was captured by 6:30 p.m., forcing the remnants of MacDonald's army to retreat. Their retreat became a rout, with many French either killed, captured, or drowned in the flooded Katzbach and Neisse rivers. The French continued their retreat under constant attack. By 1st of September, they had suffered 30,000 casualties, 2 eagles, and 100 guns compared to Blucher's 20,000. The crushing Allied victory at Katzbach shattered French morale. The battle gave rise to a German saying, now obsolete, "He's advancing like Blucher at Katzbach." Following Napoleon's victory at Dresden, General Vandamme pursued the retreating Allies with 34,000 men. Near the town of Kulm, Vandamme caught up with General Armistice Tolstoy's rearguard. If the French won, they might block the passes out, trapping the army of Bohemia between him and Napoleon. Armistice Tolstoy, with just 13,000 men, prepared for a desperate stand to hold off the French. On August 29th, Vandamme launched his offensive. In hard fighting, the Allied army repelled all Vandamme's attacks at heavy cost. By the end of the day, each side had lost approximately 6,000 men. On the second day, as Austrian and Russian reinforcements arrived, the French attack was repelled and made a daring counterattack. The situation got worse when General Kleist launched a surprise attack on Vandamme's rear. The raw French troops were unable to fend off the Allies. Vandamme's corps was almost destroyed, losing 25,000. Vandamme himself was captured along with 15,000 men, while the Allies lost 12,000. The Battle of Kulm was a disaster for the French, as the Allies recovered from their defeat at Dresden. After the defeat at Grossbeeren, Napoleon replaced Borodino with Ney, who managed to regroup the army of Berlin, assembling a force of 70,000 men. Ney soon engaged von Bülow's forces at Dennewitz. However, the Prussians fought bravely. With the arrival of Karl Johann's Swedish reinforcements, the French were pushed back and pursued, suffering 22,000 casualties. Since the start of the campaign, both sides had fought in 5 major battles, with several smaller engagements. 4 of these were decisive Allied victories. The French suffered approximately 140,000 casualties and lost 200 guns, while the Allies sustained around 70,000 casualties and lost 50 guns. On October 8, 1813, Bavaria, a French ally since 1805, joined the Sixth Coalition by signing the Treaty of Ried and declared war on France on October 14th. With Napoleon's army shrinking from 350,000 to 200,000, he chose to retreat behind the Elbe River. On October 4th, Blucher advanced and captured Wittenberg, but retreated as Napoleon moved toward him. Meanwhile, Schwarzenberg advanced on Leipzig, threatening Napoleon's retreat. Realizing the danger, Napoleon ordered all his forces to concentrate at Leipzig. Napoleon's empire hangs in the balance, as the fate of Europe is set to be decided at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. Following his crushing defeats at Leipzig in October 1813, Napoleon's forces retreated from Germany across the Rhine, costing him thousands of troops. The coalition armies paused their advance, and Clemens von Metternich offered Napoleon the Frankfurt proposals. This proposal allowed Napoleon to remain Emperor of France, while restricting the country to its natural borders, retaining Belgium, Savoy, and the Rhineland, but requiring the return of other occupied territories. However, Napoleon delayed his reply, prompting the Allies to proceed with their invasion of France. Despite the dire situation, Napoleon called up new conscripts, young and inexperienced soldiers. With much of his army still engaged in Spain and Italy, he had only 80,000 troops to face 380,000 Allied soldiers. In late December 1813 and early January 1814, the Allied armies began their advance into France. Napoleon, determined to halt the Allied advance on Paris, moved swiftly to intercept Blucher's Army of Silesia over its crossing of the Marne on January 25th. With just 40,000 men, he advanced from Vitry-le-Francois, hoping to catch the dispersed Prussian army off guard. On January 29th, he struck at Brienne, where fierce fighting erupted. forcing Blücher into retreat, but failing to deliver a decisive blow. 3 days later, at La Rotaille, Napoleon's 45,000 men faced 85,000 Allied force in a snowstorm. Despite heavy resistance, the French were forced to withdraw, suffering 5,000 casualties and lost 73 guns. However, despite greater Allied losses of 7,000, the victory at La Rotaille proved critical. The Allies did not pursue. Instead, they decided to divide their forces. Blücher advanced from the north, while Schwarzenberg advanced from the south. Napoleon wanted to defeat the Allied army in detail, so he marched rapidly with 30,000 men towards the dispersed army of Silesia. Launching a surprise attack on General Olsefev at Camp Albert, the French forces ambushed and defeated his corps, capturing him. Napoleon then targeted General Osten-Sachsen's forces, despite lacking intelligence. Intense combat ensued, with the Russians being overwhelmed. York's late arrival distracted the French, aiding Sachsen's retreat. Napoleon pursued them to Château-Thierry, but after heavy combat, the Allies managed to retreat, though suffering heavy losses. The French failed to completely destroy them. Meanwhile, Blücher attacked Marmont's the Sixth Corps, but struggled to withdraw as Napoleon swiftly reinforced him, leading to fierce combat. The French cavalry outflanked Blücher's army, forcing a full retreat and inflicting heavy losses during the pursuit. In less than a week, Napoleon inflicted 28,500 casualties and captured 36 guns from the army of Silesia. Napoleon then went south. He struck Schwarzenberg's flank, defeating his forces at Mormont, Montereau, and Marie-sur-Seine, forcing them to retreat. Blücher regrouped, but Napoleon struck his left flank, pushing him back. Blücher joined Bernadotte, boosting his forces to 100,000. Napoleon advanced to Craon on March 7th, where he faced the Allies. After heavy losses, he forced them to retreat. Napoleon clashed with Blücher at Laon, but all French assaults were repelled. Exhausted and outnumbered, his forces struggled against fierce Allied resistance. By nightfall, after losing 6,000 men, he was forced to retreat. Napoleon retreated to Soissons, as Reims failed to the Allies. Napoleon marched swiftly. On March 13th, he attacked and recaptured the city. The French inflicted heavy losses on the Allies, while sustaining minimal casualties. Napoleon moved south, initially underestimating the size of the Allied forces, believing they were in retreat. Realizing his numerical disadvantage, he ordered a withdrawal, but it was too late. A brutal battle ensued, and the French cavalry was routed. Napoleon personally rallied his troops, even exposing himself to enemy fire, with his horse being killed in the chaos. That night, the French launched an attack, striking the Allied cavalry, but ultimately being repelled. On the second day, Napoleon faced 74,000 enemy troops. After intense fighting, the French were forced to retreat. After his defeat at Arcis-sur-Aube, Napoleon moved towards Saint-Dizier to threaten Allied supply lines and rally garrisons. Meanwhile, the Allies received a letter from Talleyrand about French discontent, marched on Paris. 10,000 Allied cavalry began pursued Napoleon, while on March 25th, at Fère-Champenoise, Allied forces intercepted Marshal's Marmont and Mortier's course. After heavy fighting, the French were crushed, losing 13,000 men. Meanwhile, Napoleon defeated the Russians at Saint-Dizier. In Paris, Joseph Bonaparte defended the city with 23,000 troops under Marshals Marmont, Montcy and Mortier. The Allied army outnumbering the French, 42,000, by 100,000 men. On March 30, 1814, the Allies attacked Paris from the north and east. Despite fierce resistance, they were pushed back by the Allies. Marmont surrendered with his troops. Alexander sent an envoy to the city, offering peace. On March 31st, Talleyrand surrendered Paris keys to the Tsar. Napoleon, hearing of the surrender at Fontainebleau, wanted to recapture the city, but faced opposition from his marshals. After being opposed by his marshals, Napoleon was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, with the Empress Marie-Louise as regent. Marmont's cause was about to surrender, so the Allies refused his offer, leaving Napoleon no choice but to abdicate unconditionally.
The Allied powers, having declared that the Emperor Napoleon is the sole obstacle to the re-establishment of a general peace in Europe, the Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces, for himself and his heirs, the throne of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, not even that of life itself, which he is not willing to make for the interests of France.
Over the next few days, with Napoleon's reign over France now at an end, the Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed by Napoleon on the 13th of April. On the 20th of April, Napoleon farewelled to his old guard, saying,
"Soldiers of my old guard, I have come to bid you farewell. For 20 years you have accompanied me faithfully on the paths of honor and glory. With men like you, our cause was not lost, but the war would have dragged on interminably, and it would have been a civil war. So I am sacrificing our interests to those of our country. Do not lament my fate. If I have agreed to live on, it is to serve our glory. I wish to write the history of the great deeds we have done together. Farewell, my children."
Napoleon was exiled to Elba and became a sovereign. Napoleon's empire had fallen, his throne lost, but the legend was not over. Exile on Elba would not contain his ambition. In less than a year, he would return, marching once more to challenge Europe in one final, fateful campaign.